Layered Insight is the industry's first embedded security approach for containers. Trusted by Global 1000 enterprises to secure their containerized applications, it's the only solution that requires no root privileges, has zero dependency on the underlying infrastructure, and is fully portable across any container environment. Unified DevOps and SecOps, enabling the rapid development of containerized applications without worrying about security. To learn more, please visit layeredinsight.com/ASW. Innovation's a funny thing, in a cosmic sort of way. While it drives your business forward, it also exposes new risks that can slow you down. As an IT or security professional, every day you need to know, are you vulnerable? Are you compromised? And finally, are you optimized to quickly spot and resolve issues to keep your operation humming? It's your responsibility to help the organization safely and reliably implement the latest connected technologies. So how can you outsmart this little paradox? Rapid7 solutions are powered by advanced analytics and an unmatched understanding of the attacker's mindset. Visit rapid7.com to learn more about how Rapid7 products transform data into action. Signal Sciences is the industry's first web protection platform that works in any cloud, any container, any platform as a service, and any modern application architecture. The Signal Sciences web protection platform can be deployed in next-generation WAF, RASP, or reverse proxy modes, giving customers ultimate flexibility and coverage. Protect your web applications with Signal Sciences web protection platform. Signal Sciences, protecting applications, connecting teams. For more information, check them out at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome back, everyone, to Application Security Weekly. A couple of quick announcements here. First, the webcast with Distill Networks on 9 ways to protect your business is being held on Wednesday, April 25th. Register now at securityweekly.com/Distill Networks. That's DISTIL Networks. Also, just as a side note there, so once again, Distill Networks, check that out. Another note, BugCrowd is hiring. So that's the company I work for. I am now a solutions architect at BugCrowd, so recent change on my part. But yeah, after closing our Series C funding at $26 million, BugCrowd is expanding its headcount across the organization. Check out bugcrowd.com/careers or email me, which is hoodie@securityweekly.com if you have any questions about any of those positions. So with that, Paul, into the week's news. A couple of FTP vulnerabilities popped up here in the news. Specifically CVE 2017-17405, there was a nice article under story number 1 for bugs, breaches, and more, talking about libcurl vulnerability. Did you read anything about this, Paul?
I haven't. It's still amazing that we're still using FTP. Really?
I know, right? So what was interesting, it was a Heroku article talking about how they basically went and patched their environment, but then onward, they started looking at things that customers use, such as Ruby, right? They started to get an idea of, okay, what are some things that we need to think about in terms of just hardening our customers? So last night on Pulse Security Weekly, we actually had a really good discussion on Cisco Talos going about looking for vulnerabilities in what ended up being a competitor's product and responsibly disclosing it to them and then eventually publicizing their findings. This is, I think, of a similar vein. It was Heroku is a cloud service provider for a number of different things, such as, containers, applications, etc.
Oh, so I'm still wrapping my brain around Heroku. They're a competitor to Amazon AWS?
Yeah, I guess I would say that that's probably accurate.
More likely ECS, right? And some of the other Lambda, perhaps?
I would say that Heroku is probably more of a competitor with DigitalOcean is probably the better example to describe. Amazon and Azure and Google Cloud for, kind of the third runner up there are in a class of their own with these things. But Heroku does definitely offer a great cloud provider for, hosting your applications in the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
So they do a number of things, including some security research. So actually, I think I'm trying to remember. Trey Ford, I believe, actually is either the CISO or.
Oh, okay. Yes, I think he still holds that position today. Yes, I think that's where he ended up, and we should get him on the show.
We should. We absolutely should. But his team there at Heroku basically took the next step after patching this vulnerability in their own stuff and said, "Hey, this vulnerability should probably be addressed for things that our customers actually use." So they went and looked at Ruby specifically, kind of on a hunch based on what customers were using inside of their platform, and started looking at the FTP implementation that Ruby actually was leveraging. And so this article goes through a kind of a nice walkthrough of the steps that they took to kind of investigate, to then look at where the vulnerabilities might exist, and ultimately through to reporting it to the Ruby folks, who ended up actually replacing it was a function which was just an open function, open with the what could be malicious code, to file.open, which actually solved the vulnerability right then and there instead of Ruby. And then they ended up being able to patch it. But it looked like the vulnerability itself affected Ruby 2.2.8, 2.3.5, 2.4.2, and 2.5.0-preview 1 for basically everything earlier than those versions within those series. So if you have Ruby and you're at or below those minor version numbers within those series, you probably should patch at this point. But good on Heroku and the team over there, under Trey Ford, for getting this handled. I thought that was kind of a nice showing of support for the community by a cloud service provider. Any thoughts?
Well, and I think we've seen this as a trend where the service providers, especially the ones with newer technology, Amazon, Docker, for example, providing some level of service to identify vulnerabilities. We've seen GitHub do that as well, where they're actively looking for vulnerabilities in their customers' data and reporting those. And I think that's great. However, it's not comprehensive. In my opinion, what I've seen so far, and not taking away from Trey, and who's a good friend, and the team at Heroku, but what I really want as a customer is something more comprehensive. I think it's difficult for a larger organization to have that level of coverage for vulnerabilities if they're not a vulnerability scanning or a company that's focused on vulnerabilities. If we look at something like WhiteSource, their database is outstanding in terms of coverage. And so to get that level of coverage, I had to go purchase another product. And I would like to see more either partnership, potentially acquisitions, I predict in this space would be fantastic. That way I manage it in one platform. Like if I'm using Heroku, I'm deploying my applications, it's automatically telling me native in the platform that there are vulnerabilities in my libraries that I'm using. I think that's really cool. I don't know how much my prediction is going to be true. We could be buying this as a separate service, from now to the end of time, or not. We'll see, how things shake out. But I like managing less solutions, not more. So if my app is in Amazon, I want Amazon to have some really good coverage for vulnerabilities in this context, and not just pointing out some ad hoc ones or having like a really small subset of vulnerabilities that they're telling me about, which basically forces my hand to go get more additional tools. And we already have tool fatigue today, as in DevOps, in a big way. So those are my thoughts.
And I think that what you end up seeing, though, is there's definitely consolidation in this space in general, not necessarily like the Amazon, Google's, Heroku's, DigitalOcean's, et cetera, buying up other organizations. But great example of this is Synopsys, right? So they bought Cigital, they bought what was the other one? I think was it Black Duck?
Yes, they did buy Black Duck. Yes.
Right.
Yep.
And then CA bought Veracode, and they actually just acquired SourceClear, which is meant to be like a competitor to WhiteSource.
Is it? Is that what they do? I couldn't figure out what they did from their website, which is not a shining recommendation for them, but it just could be that their website isn't very good, and it has nothing to do with whether the technology is good or not. But so SourceClear is a competitor to WhiteSource in the Black Duck now Synopsys. Is that true?
Yeah, so that's my understanding. Is it's open source scanning, looking for licensing sort of problems, etc. So yeah, I mean, there's a number of companies that are kind of getting into that space, and quite frankly, when you look at the kind of numbers that are getting thrown around in terms of the acquisition amounts, right? There's very clearly a demand for this sort of technology, and to your point, Paul, I think that eventually what will happen is we'll have the Synopsys, the CAs, the IBMs that will come in and just scoop up a lot of these offerings and then just consolidate as one company. Now, it makes me wonder, though, if at one point or another you'll start to see partnerships start to align, right? So you'll see like a Synopsys partners with Amazon and a CA partners with Microsoft, sort of thing, so that they are built into the platform directly, right? So because I think that those companies are too big to see real acquisitions take place from one to the other. But yeah, I think that we are going to eventually see built in by default, hopefully, maybe by default, functionality for this sort of problem solving. Um, to be seen, of course, but that's kind of my hope. So I'm going to skip down a couple stories here. In probably one of the most, well, maybe after last week, the second most obvious title or headline under bugs, breaches, and more is warning: your Windows PC can get hacked just by visiting a website. Really? Like, come on, man. Isn't this like what, 20 years old, 30 years old now that this has been taking place? But basically, this is talking about the 5 critical vulnerabilities that were patched for Windows just this past week, affecting things like Windows 10, 8.1, RT 8.1, 7, Windows Server 2008, 12, and 16, around some of the exploits that basically a user could open a malicious file, who knew, and then get hit with something like a Microsoft Windows graphics vulnerability for denial of service, or other sorts of vulnerabilities that would populate as a result of just simply browsing to a website.
Yeah, and it's the rendering of the malicious fonts that can cause that,
Yep.
which is very similar to like rendering graphics, which ultimately ends up being accessed by your web browser, which it breeds this headline of, yeah, you visit a site and they can trigger those vulnerabilities and exploit them if you're loading a graphic or loading a specific font. And you're right, these attacks have been around for a while, but this latest round I think is pretty bad in terms of these types of attacks coming to the surface again.
Well, so, and it's interesting as well, because under the "if you build it, they will come," we actually talk about a very specific kind of neat trick, I guess, around doing things with fonts to kind of fingerprint your code, for lack of a better term, or fingerprint your text. So to that end, yeah, it's, fonts need to be rendered, and a system that renders them could have remote code execution or other vulnerabilities associated with it as a result of Windows just not doing rendering exceedingly well for web applications. So yeah, get ye to the patchery on Windows in general, but especially because let's face it, people get phished with links all the time, and if they don't even have to do anything other than click on the link and open it in a browser, that's just bad, right? Like, that's just going to lead to that. So moving on to the next section, though, NPM actually acquired Uplift Security, which is the makers of the Node security platform. I think, was it last year, Paul? You actually ended up having an interview with the folks on the Node security platform on Paul's Security Weekly, if I'm not mistaken.
But I don't remember that, but
I could be mistaken. I could be thinking of a different show, but it was Adam Baldwin and the team basically over at Uplift. They make the Node security platform, which basically scans for vulnerabilities in NPM and Node packages in general, and identifies malicious packages, which, let's face it, NPM is growing like a monster, so needed to happen. And according to this announcement, Uplift Security has been working with NPM longer than NPM has actually been a company. So it kind of made sense for them to merge at this point. They did cite at the bottom of the article, and I quote, "Security is the responsibility of every part of an organization, and it needs to be intermixed with engineering, operations, and application development. NPM is at the center of these workflows, so we are working to be uniquely positioned to help you secure your code."
So NPM is the organization that maintains and controls all of your packages or add-ons for Node.js applications. Is that true? So they're kind of like Docker Hub does for Docker containers, NPM does for add-ons to Node.js.
Yeah, it's a package manager. So just like in this case, you have packages up in apt that you go and grab, or you have
right. But now they've bought. Thing, right? So, they basically are doing exactly what we just talked about, right? They've bought Uplift, right, which provides security for the add-ons for NPM. So my prediction already came true, which is awesome. I like it.
It just happened.
It just happened. You teed that up nicely.
So yeah, I thought that was kind of a neat article as well, because the Node security platform has done a really good job in terms of monitoring and hopefully making that whole ecosystem a lot better. And in fact, at some point, it might have been in a news article as well that you covered. There was I don't know if it was the folks at Uplift, but they were basically looking at typos that people would make in terms of package names and then creating, benign but otherwise malicious packages using those mistyped names,
so that no one
uploading
else
them
could.
to npm.
So that no one else
Well,
could.
yeah, right. That's
Right?
exactly it. Right. But to that end, if they were in fact malicious, I hope that the node security platform would have caught them. But to that end, yeah, exactly. It is an ecosystem that is the wild, wild west, right? Like there's no like code checking, or at least there wasn't up until now, hopefully.
Right.
But also, anyone can register to upload packages, and it could be a package that does this just about anything. So it could be a real problem. But thankfully, hopefully this will be, the path for making a kind of a good solution here. I did want to skip ahead, just kind of being cognizant of time here. So there was actually a really good article on Duo Security, story number 4 under the If You Build It section, talking about web application bugs and from the timelines from disclosure to exploit. So Larry Cashdollar, which I had to actually look up Larry to confirm that it was a real person, because I thought that was like a handle for his last name, but it's not. He's a real person. Works at Akamai Security Incident Response.
Cash rules everything around
Cash
me. Cream, get the money. Dollar bills, y'all.
We take the life. So anyway, Larry worked at Akamai Security Incident Response Team, and he basically looked at weaponized web application vulnerabilities. So he did some research on timelines around how long it takes people to actually go about leveraging vulnerabilities that are disclosed regarding web applications. And as we talked about on a previous segment, or rather I should say a previous show, web application vulnerabilities made up 50% of the MITRE CVE assignment last year for those that were assigned. Not to say that 50% of all vulnerabilities, but for the assigned vulnerabilities, it made up 50%. And what he found was, so specifically in some Joomla extensions, the things that he disclosed went for almost over a year before they were even really, being
no one.
or
Please tell me no one's using. Well, I guess people are using Joomla, but
right.
It is a platform that obviously, from is it Larry's research, that is not getting any attention for security. In what we've covered about Joomla and hearing that, like, you should not use Joomla, and if you are, you should be running away from it as fast as you possibly can.
Well, what was interesting is apparently Joomla isn't even popular enough for black hats to leverage the vulnerabilities that were publicly disclosed against it in the first place, because it doesn't have enough adoption.
I kind of put it up there with like Cold Fusion's kind of a similar kind of thing too. If you're looking at, either CRMs or some kind of framework like that, you should be looking at ones that are more popular. WordPress has its issues, of course, right? But and I think in terms of languages and frameworks, certainly I think Node has become very popular, as well as a lot of other technologies. Python Flask is what we use here, but there's lots of other more modern options that are being kept up to date and integrated with more of the modern tool sets and development processes. So I feel like, and listeners weigh in on it, that Joomla and Cold Fusion are just platforms you should not be using, but I'd be interested to see, who's still using them and why. Maybe not by name, probably don't want to admit that, but like, if you're like, why are you still using it? What are the challenges to get off it? Or is there some benefit to using some of these? I mean, these frameworks have been around for a while. Like Joomla's a CRM, right?
I believe so. I mean, honestly, I haven't used Joomla in forever. So
yeah, CRM. Joomla's a CMS similar to WordPress. Yep. But I bring up Cold Fusion because I don't know why I put those in the same. But Cold Fusion is a language, or more like a framework rather than not and it's an Adobe product, which
people have built CMSs with
Cold Fusion. God.
Yeah. So that's kind of the connector.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe there are reasons to use these, Keith. I mean, have you ever used any of these technologies that we just talked about?
Honestly, no. I mean, like I've avoided, Joomla a little bit. I will say just a little bit, and then I moved away from it because I was like, I don't need this. But to that end, I will say this, right? Attackers, for the most part, are looking for what they can leverage broadly, and so WordPress obviously is kind of the big one because it fills up something like 15% of the entire internet. So to that end, just kind of wrap up that article. Larry is quoted as saying, it seemed that the malicious actors would use ExploitDB and CX security websites specifically as their RSS feed of vetted working exploits. So effectively, we are giving them the weapons that they are now leveraging, which is good. It's also hopefully, giving people the onus to go and patch things. I think at one point, Paul, and I could be misremembering this, but I think it might have been the Verizon data breach incident report that said that the number one indicator, and this was years ago, the number one indicator of a company patching within a certain time frame was if it had a Metasploit exploit available for it.
Sure.
Which
sure.
I think it was like within 2 weeks of a Metasploit exploit package being put together, most companies patch. So who knows? But just being cognizant of time. Paul, do you have a few more minutes, or should we wrap up?
Oh no, we started a couple minutes late, Keith. So let's finish out the stories.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, I was going to say, because there were a couple more that I wanted to hit.
Sure.
Specifically, there's one that I highlighted to you before the show. It's attitudes to security in the JavaScript community. Seeing as how we covered JavaScript last time, I thought that this was valuable and important. Thank you to Casey Dunham, a friend of mine and former trainer with me at DerbyCon last year, for recommending this article. So it's number 5 under the If You Build It section. And it has a highlighted section on basically how the JavaScript community is looking at security today. And it turns out I'm going to couch it this way, that about 3 out of 4 people in the JavaScript community are concerned about the security of JavaScript. But that also means that 1 in 4 JavaScript developers aren't concerned, which is kind of scary. Like, that's somewhat of a high number to me. What do you think, Paul?
I have an issue with the way the question was asked. I think expressing concern is somewhat arbitrary. Like, when I fill out this survey, I think it's, and I'm not the survey expert, Michael's more the survey, expert, but my assessment is that if I get asked, am I concerned about security? Most people, regardless of the context of the question, they're going to say yes, because they don't want to feel bad. They want to express concern, like, yes, I am. I'm very concerned about security. That doesn't actually mean that they're doing things to make their code or application more secure, which would be a better question. And you could, I guess you could ask both. Like, if you answered yes, you are concerned, then what actions have you taken? What have you implemented to address your concerns? And then I think that you would probably get a large percentage of people going, yeah, I'm concerned, but I'm not really doing anything about it right now.
I haven't done anything about this, right? I haven't actually solved it.
Yeah, I think that would be a better, and I'm not sure if they did actually ask this in the survey, but that would be a much better gauge for us to see that, well, yeah, people are concerned, but maybe they do, if they didn't implement anything, why? Is it because they don't have the right tools? Is it because they don't have the time? What was the reasoning behind that? And then we can kind of get to the crux of the issue, and hopefully come up with solutions to say, well, maybe JavaScript developers, what do they need? Maybe they don't know about the solutions that exist. So I think that the survey was kind of lame in that respect.
Well, so one of the questions that they do ask a little bit later, and it doesn't necessarily get exactly to where you're trying to drive to with the questioning, but it does, I think, get a little bit closer, which is talking about the respondents in terms of those that aren't satisfied with the security or have concerns about the security. 52% of those respondents aren't satisfied with the tools that they've got to evaluate open source code security and quality. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like of the 77% that have concerns, about half of them, so maybe 1/3 of the total the body of people that were surveyed or that responded to the survey, aren't happy with the things that they are using today or the things that are available to them to actually address this problem space. Which is maybe why companies like Sneak and White Source and Black Duck and Clear are being bought up at such high valuations, because let's face it, developers, it sounds like at least that 1/3 of the respondents are looking for better tools because the ones they have aren't good enough, which is a positive thing. It means that they're actually paying attention to some degree, right?
Well, I think 100% of the people surveyed that don't know about a vulnerability aren't going to report it because they don't know about it. So in that sense, a lot of these surveys are flawed, right? Like, if you're not, even if you are looking, how do you know if something is vulnerable and your tools and your process just haven't discovered it? You can't report that in a survey unless you're analyzing their source code. So take surveys with a grain of salt, because I guarantee you that a lot of development shops out there today, sure, they might be using tools, but how do you know how much you're missing if you're not measuring it or looking in the right places. I mean, coming from vulnerability management, right? That was kind of one of the things I would think about a lot is I can look at, am I looking at everything, and how do I know what I'm missing? And that's insecurity. Yeah. And we talked about that last night in a different context, right? But that's an issue today, and it's an issue with a lot of these surveys too.
So one of the things that they do cover toward the end, which I think there are two specific sections toward the end that I thought that were valuable. So first was comparing the experienced group to the least experienced group that was part of the survey. So it sounds like in the survey you reported, how many years of experience you have doing JavaScript development. And so when you compare the more experienced group, they are actually using things like a testing framework, 87% to 57%, most experienced to least experienced. Using a linter, so actually finding kind of bad coding practices as part of the development process, 90% to 75%, right? So almost a full 15% more, or in this case, 15% more are actually using like some sort of good coding practice standardization, right? Which is again a good way of making sure you avoid introducing vulnerabilities. But then also code reviews, 79 to 50%. External audits of code. This is the big one. 26% of the experienced respondents have external audits of code versus 9% of those that are least experienced, right? So that's 1 in 4 versus 1 in 10, which I thought was a pretty big indicator that these people are actually taking security a little bit more seriously. Maybe not at the scale that we wanted to see, but at least that they're looking into it. And then the last one, which gets to, I think, the tools problem here, Paul, is most likely to use automated scans for security flaws in code. The experienced developers, 53%. The inexperienced developers, 27%. So it sounds like you can almost gauge the maturity of an organization as well, based on their use of the following kind of tools and processes available to them.
Yep.
So yeah, that's kind of the last thing I wanted to cover there. There is just maybe one more story that I wanted to cover. Oh, well, two things. First, I actually wanted to give a shout out to Emily Shi. She wrote a pretty cool Matrix Digital Rain kind of like emulation for your video cameras or your photos. So that's an open source project, story number 3 under Food for Thought. Emily, very cool little project, and I really enjoyed seeing that on Twitter. So thank you for letting us highlight that on the show. The last Food for Thought article that I want to cover, though, is Michigan has outlawed the possession of ransomware, which is good because it sounds like in this case, they left enough room for, unlike their Georgia counterparts, for security research to take place. But they've gone about making the possession of, with intent to use, ransomware as a felony, which can lead to something like 3 years in jail.
Yeah, I have an issue with that because intent is somewhat ambiguous. Like what?
That's true.
Okay, so I have ransomware, and that in and of itself is not illegal according to the way I read the law. And I'm not a lawyer. I don't pretend to play one here on the show. But with intent to introduce it into a computer or computer network without authorization, accessing a computer or computer network without authorization already covered by CFAA, right?
Yep.
But that intent, so does that mean, the way I am concerned about it is, if I've got some ransomware that I'm analyzing and I make a tweet and I joke about, wow, this would be really bad if I release this into the wild, does that show intent? And now am I going to be prosecuted and potentially serve 3 years in jail because I had ransomware and I made a tweet? The tweet showed intent and I have ransomware. That's where I have an issue with some of these laws, and it leaves too much to the interpretation of the law for me to be comfortable with this kind of introduction. I also think that criminalizing certain types of software, the mere possession or intent with that, I don't agree with that either, because you can possess software and maybe it is ransomware. And how do you define ransomware? I mean, have they defined it in the law? How do you define what ransomware is? So, I mean, there's ransomware that makes you play a video game to unlock your files. There's, a lot of different ways we could classify ransomware, and a lot of different ways we could classify intent. And I just don't think that this legislation, how is that, then the final point is, how is that going to stop ransomware from executing in this state? I mean, most of the ransomware that's going to be installed, they're not in that state. Likely, they're not even in that country in the U.S.
I wonder if that makes it. Doesn't that make it like a federal crime then? If a state law, has some sort of regulation around it, and now you've crossed state lines, so it becomes a federal violation. So it already covers under CFAA as a result.
That I'm not
of
sure. That would have to ask a lawyer about, and I'm sure it depends.
For sure.
Right?
I am also not a lawyer, and I also do not play the show.
So I just don't think but how this legislation has absolutely no chance of slowing down or stopping ransomware from being installed anywhere. And that's really the crux of it. Because if you are an evil, bad person that's installing ransomware on people's systems, you're already violating federal laws. Why would a state law, we got to stay away from Michigan. We're doing something illegal, so we don't want to do something illegal in Michigan. You're already doing something illegal. Anyway.
Yeah, and so to that end as well, Paul, it's a situation of, it makes me wonder if laws like this end up being used by federal courts or federal prosecutors to say, we're going to try them in Michigan because we can get more, years on their sentence as a result of it, right? That's all it really leads to, is they choose the state that they're going to prosecute in.
Yep. To get more, it could be. I just don't like it. I put it right up there with the laws in Georgia. I don't think they're going to have any impact.
Which, by the way, side update on that: the governor, as of this morning, when I looked at the legislative website, the governor has yet to sign that bill that was passed in Georgia. So stay tuned on that. I'll continue to follow up on it. Last two items I'll just call out. We don't have to necessarily go into them, but under food for thought, story number 4 and story number 5. The return of my favorite webcomic commit strip. What's the solution for this massive problem, and the price of backups. So go check out those webcomics. I think they're hilarious. With that, thank you everyone for joining us this week for another episode of Application Security Weekly. Remember to git commit and stay classy.